All right, let's just dive right in. We are absolutely surrounded by data, right? But have you ever really stopped to think about how messy most of it is, especially when it's data about something as fundamental as life and death? The real challenge for experts is figuring out how to take all that chaos and turn it into something clean, something useful, without accidentally burying the truth in the process. It's a really high-stakes balancing act. You see, when you first take raw mortality data, the actual number of deaths from a study at every single age, and you plot it on a graph, it doesn't look like some nice, smooth curve. No way. It looks chaotic. It's jumpy. It bounces all over the place. And that's because of random chance and what statisticians call sampling errors. In short, it's just noisy. And that right there is the million-dollar question. If the raw data is too much of a mess to be useful, how do we find the real pattern that's hiding underneath it all? How do you separate the signal from all that static? Well, that's exactly what we're going to break down in this explainer. So first up, let's get a really solid handle on why using this raw or crude data is such a problem to begin with. The problems are pretty obvious when you lay them out. The numbers just jump around erratically from one age to the next. And this is mostly because of those random sampling errors we talked about, which get even worse when you're working with smaller groups of people. And this creates a huge practical problem. I mean, can you imagine trying to set insurance premiums that zigzag up and down with every single birthday? It'd be completely impossible to justify to a customer, let alone run a stable business. So, since we can't just use the raw data as is, we've got to do something about it. We need a way to, iron out all those random bumps and see the real shape hiding underneath. And that process actually has a name. It's called graduation. Now, what's so interesting here is the language. It's not about changing the data. It's about improving the estimates. Actuaries use these statistical methods to create what they call a graduated set of rates, which is really just a smoothed out, much more useful version of that original messy data. When you get right down to it, graduation is trying to do three main things. First, create a smooth set of rates that you can actually use for something practical, like pricing an insurance policy. Second, it's about filtering out all that random noise as best you can. And third, and this is the clever part, it's about using the information from nearby ages, say from age 41 and 43, to get a much more reliable estimate for age 42. It's kind of like letting the data points help their neighbors out. But, and believe me, this is a huge but, this whole process isn't just some simple math trick. It is a very delicate compromise. It's a constant trade-off between two forces that are pulling in opposite directions. And this lays out the core dilemma perfectly. On one hand, your new smoothed-out curve has to actually reflect the original data. It has to fit well. You can't just make up a nice-looking line that ignores the evidence. But on the other hand, the entire point of the exercise is to get that smoothness, to get rid of those jagged random jumps. And these two goals are always at odds. It's so easy to get this wrong. I mean, if you chase perfect smoothness, you might ignore what the data is trying to tell you. But if you stick perfectly to the raw data, then you haven't smoothed anything at all. If you lean too far in either direction, you end up with some serious problems. So if you focus too much on smoothness, you get something called overgraduation. You end up with this beautiful, elegant curve that might completely miss the real story in the data, overestimating the risk here and underestimating it there. Now, if you go the other way, you get undergraduation. That's where you've hugged the original noisy data so tightly that your final curve is still a chaotic mess. You haven't really solved the problem at all. So this is where it all gets really interesting. If this whole thing is a balancing act, how in the world do you know when you've hit that perfect sweet spot? How do you judge whether you got it right? Well, luckily, you don't just have to rely on your gut feeling. You bring in some impartial judges to make the call for you. That's right. Instead of just eyeballing it, actuaries use a whole battery of statistical tests. You can think of them as a team of inspectors, each one designed to look at the smoothed data from a slightly different angle to spot any potential flaws. We can kind of simplify this whole inspection process into two main steps. First, you do a big picture overall check. A test called the chi-squared test is great for this. It basically asks, on the whole, does my smooth model generally match the original data? But that's not enough. So for step 2, you bring in more specialized tests to hunt for bias. These look for more subtle, sneaky problems, like whether your model is consistently a little too high or a little too low across the board. And these referees, they are very thorough. They're asking all the tough questions. Is the overall fit okay? Sure. But are a few really big errors being hidden by a bunch of tiny ones? Is there a consistent bias where the model is always a little bit off in the same direction? Or maybe are there specific clumps of ages, say in the late 50s, where the model is way off, even if it looks good everywhere else? Just relying on one test means you can miss these critical flaws. Okay, so I get it. This is a pretty complex statistical process. But why should any of us really care? Well, it's because getting this balance right or wrong has massive real-world financial consequences. This quote from the source material really just says it all, doesn't it? This isn't just some academic thought experiment. The numbers that come out of this process are used to set the price for real financial products. You get this wrong, and a whole company could be at risk. And the risks are huge in both directions. For life insurance, if you underestimate how many people are likely to pass away, your premiums will be too low to cover the claims. You're going to lose money. But for things like pensions and annuities, the risk is the complete opposite. If you overestimate mortality, you'll end up paying people a higher income because you assume they won't live as long. When they live longer than you expected, you lose money. A single model that's biased one way or the other can be an absolute disaster. So what this all comes down to is that this very careful, very methodical process of smoothing data, well, it's one of the cornerstones of financial stability for insurance companies and pension funds all over the world. It's what allows them to manage massive risks responsibly. And all of this leaves us with one final big question to think about. This whole process is about finding a true signal inside a lot of noise. But it is a very, very delicate dance. And as we rely more and more on models to make sense of our complex world, we have to constantly be asking ourselves, are our tools actually helping us see reality more clearly? Or are they just creating a smooth, convenient, and ultimately false picture of the world?